She was a struggling baker drowning in debt. He was a cold billionaire CEO bound by a contract. What started as a loveless marriage of convenience soon turned into a battle of hearts and a secret that could change everything. Hello, my friends. Before we begin this amazing story, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and how your day is going, all right? And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The scent of burnt sugar and shattered dreams clung to Amelia. Mia Peterson like a second skin. It was a phantom smell, a cruel trick of memory, because inside her bakery, the ovens were cold for the first time in 3 years. She stood on the damp pavement of Hayes Street, the pre-dawn San Francisco fog rolling in from the bay to wrap the world in a shroud of grey indifference. Plastered across the cheerful robin's egg blue of her front door was a slash of violent red, an eviction notice. The paper, already beaded with moisture, seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. Each stark black letter was a nail hammered into the coffin of her life's work. The official seal at the bottom was a final, unforgiving stamp on her failure. Her hand, trembling slightly, was clenched into a fist at her side. The crisp, crinkling sound of the notice she'd ripped down moments ago, the only protest she could muster against the overwhelming silence. This place, the Daily Rise, was more than just a business. It was the physical manifestation of every early morning, every flour-dusted apron, every ounce of defiant hope she had poured into its foundation. It was the only family she had ever truly known, a warm, breathing sanctuary she had built with her own 2 hands against a world that had always felt transient and cold. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a familiar, venomous vibration. She knew, without looking, it was another automated call from the predatory lender, a robotic voice ready to remind her of the $50,000 chasm that had opened beneath her feet, a debt that needed to be paid in less than a month. The weight of it all pressed down, threatening to splinter the very bones in her spine. She finally pushed the key into the lock, the familiar click echoing with a hollow finality in the empty street. Inside, the darkness was absolute, a stark contrast to the usual warm glow that spilled from the bakery's windows before the sun even considered rising. The air, typically thick with the life-affirming aromas of fermenting sourdough, melting chocolate and toasted nuts, was now stale and chilled. It smelled of cold metal and despair. Mia didn't bother with the lights. She navigated the familiar space by heart, her fingertips brushing against the cool stainless steel counters, the silent hulking forms of the mixers, the cold, unforgiving marble of the proving table. This was her kingdom, now a tomb. Her entire life had been a frantic, desperate scramble for stability, a direct reaction to a childhood spent bouncing between foster homes, each one a temporary stop where she learned the brutal lesson that dependency was a weakness and trust was a currency she couldn't afford. The Daily Rise was meant to be the end of that scramble. It was her declaration of independence, proof that she could not only survive on her own, but thrive. She had poured every cent of her meager savings, worked 3 jobs, and sold a car she couldn't afford to lose, all to sign the lease on this tiny storefront. The loan, the one that was now strangling her, had been a calculated risk for a state-of-the-art deck oven, a magnificent beast of steel and stone that promised the perfect crust and crumb, the one final piece that would elevate her craft from a passion to a sustainable enterprise. Instead, a faulty electrical panel had fried its motherboard 6 weeks ago, and the warranty had been a labyrinth of corporate double talk. The repairs had eaten what little cash flow she had, and the loan payments had begun to default, the interest compounding with predatory speed. "Just a little more time," she whispered into the darkness, the words swallowed by the oppressive silence. "That's all I ever needed." A week later, that silence was broken by an email with a subject line so sterile and corporate it felt like a slap in the face. "Confidential proposal regarding Peterson Bakery, LLC." It was from a law firm she had never heard of, Locke, Reed and Associates, representing an anonymous client. Her first instinct was to delete it, to dismiss it as some elaborate phishing scam preying on the desperate. But desperation was a powerful motivator. She opened it. The email was brief, formal, and utterly baffling, requesting an in-person meeting to discuss a mutually beneficial financial arrangement. Curiosity, tinged with the metallic taste of dread, gnawed at her. With every other door slammed shut and boarded over, she found herself agreeing to a meeting at a sleek, minimalist coffee shop. Downtown, a place with polished concrete floors and $100 pour-overs that felt a universe away from her warm, flower-dusted world. The woman who greeted her, Evelyn Reed, was the human embodiment of the coffee shop, chic, expensive, and radiating an intimidating efficiency. Her grey suit was perfectly tailored, her handshake firm, her smile a polite but impenetrable barrier. "Ms. Peterson," she began, her voice as smooth and cool as the marble table between them, "thank you for your time. I represent a client with a significant interest in your current financial predicament and a unique proposition to resolve it." Mia's guard went up instantly. "I'm not interested in another loan, Ms. Reed, especially not from someone who won't even give me their name." Evelyn merely inclined her head, unfazed. "This is not a loan. It is a contract, a service agreement of a sort." She slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the table. Mia's breath hitched as she read the first page, her eyes scanning the dense legalese, the words blurring and then snapping into a focus so sharp it felt like a physical blow. Marriage, contract, 1 year, $250,000. The proposal was an obscenity, a grotesque caricature of a solution that felt more like a damnation. Mia stared at Evelyn Reed, searching for any sign of a joke, a prank, but the lawyer's face remained a mask of detached professionalism. The document in front of her detailed a 1-year, legally binding marriage to a man named Caleb Vance, a name she vaguely recognized from the glossy pages of business magazines her customers sometimes left behind. A reclusive tech billionaire, the phantom CEO of Vance Enterprises, a man who was practically a modern myth in the Bay Area. The contract stipulated that upon the successful completion of the 1-year term, she would receive a payment of $250,000, more than enough to obliterate her debt and secure the daily rise for years to come. In exchange, she was to perform the duties of a wife in the public eye, attend a handful of corporate and social events, and most importantly, abide by a strict set of rules designed to maintain absolute emotional and physical distance. "You can't be serious," Mia breathed, pushing the portfolio back across the table as if it were contaminated. "This is insane. You want me to marry a stranger for money? To sell myself?" Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "It is a business arrangement. Ms. Peterson, my client requires a wife to secure his controlling interest in his family's trust, which has a marriage clause stipulated by his late father. The arrangement would be, for all intents and purposes, platonic, a performance." The clinical, detached way she described it made it sound even more sordid. The humiliation burned in Mia's chest, a hot, acrid tide of indignation. "My life isn't for sale," Mia said, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and despair. "My bakery might be failing, but my dignity isn't. Find someone else to play this sick game." She stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the concrete floor, the sound turning heads throughout the quiet cafe. But as she turned to leave, Evelyn's voice stopped her, not with a plea, but with a simple, devastating statement of fact. "The primary lien holder on your business loan, Kestrel Capital, is scheduled to seize all your assets in 22 days. They will auction your equipment for pennies on the dollar, and you will be left not only with nothing, but with the remainder of the debt. This is not a game, Ms. Peterson. It is, for better or worse, your only way out." Driven by a desperation that tasted like ash in her mouth, Mia agreed to meet him. The address Evelyn provided was for a skyscraper in Pacific Heights, a gleaming needle of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the perpetual gray of the sky. The private elevator opened directly into his penthouse, and for a moment, Mia forgot how to breathe. The space was immense, a cavern of white marble, polished chrome, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a godlike panoramic view of the Golden Gate Bridge and the churning bay below. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but it was the beauty of a glacier, vast, cold, and utterly devoid of life. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter, no sign that a human being actually lived there. It was less a home and more a monument to isolation. Caleb Vance stood by the window, a tall, imposing silhouette against the dramatic backdrop. When he turned, his face was just as severe and unforgiving as his surroundings. He was handsome in a way that was almost cruel, with sharp, intelligent features, but his eyes were a flat, emotionless gray, and his mouth was set in a firm, unyielding line. He didn't offer a greeting, a handshake, or even a nod. He simply gestured to a severe-looking leather chair that seemed miles away from its counterpart. "You've read the terms," he stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone that held no warmth whatsoever. It wasn't a question. "I have questions," Mia countered, her own voice sounding small and thin in the cavernous room. "This is my life you're proposing to rearrange." A flicker of something, impatience perhaps, crossed his face. "The arrangement is not about your life. It is about a legal and logistical necessity. Your compliance is what is being compensated." He began to pace slowly, his expensive shoes making no sound on the pristine marble floor. He moved with a contained, predatory grace that was both captivating and deeply unsettling. "Let me be perfectly clear, so there are no misunderstandings, Ms. Peterson. The rules are not suggestions. They are inviolable conditions of our agreement." He held up a hand, beginning to tick off the points, as if reciting a legal brief. 1. The marriage is for a term of 365 days. On the anniversary of the signing, our lawyers will file for a quiet, no-fault dissolution, not 1 day more, not 1 day less. His gaze was intense, analytical, as if he were assessing a piece of faulty code. 2. You will reside in this penthouse. Your quarters are in the east wing, mine are in the west. The central living and kitchen areas are communal in theory, but are to be used with discretion. My private wing, which includes my office and bedroom suite, is unequivocally off-limits. You will afford me the same courtesy." He paused, his eyes sweeping over her, making her feel like an unwelcome intrusion, a speck of dust in his sterile sanctuary. 3. There will be no physical intimacy beyond what is required for our public appearances. A hand on the arm at a gala, perhaps. Nothing more. Is that understood? Mia could only nod, the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck. He was making it painfully clear that he found the idea of touching her as appealing as handling a hazardous material. 4, he continued, his tone becoming even colder. All personal and emotional inquiries are forbidden. My past, my family, my work, they are not your concern. Likewise, I have no interest in yours. We are business partners, nothing more. The finality in his voice was like a slamming door. And 5, the payment of $250,000 will be transferred to an account of your choosing, but only after the first 6 months of our arrangement have been completed without incident. Any breach of these terms will result in the immediate termination of the contract and forfeiture of the payment. He stopped in front of her, his presence looming and immense. These are the terms. They are not negotiable. Do you accept? In that moment, standing in that cold, empty palace in the sky, Mia felt the last vestiges of her independence crumbling, turning to dust. She saw the red eviction notice, smelled the cold ovens, and felt the crushing weight of her dream dying. The choice wasn't a choice at all. It was a surrender. "I accept," she whispered. the words tasting like a betrayal of everything she had ever fought to be. The wedding, if one could call it that, was an affair as sterile and transactional as the contract that birthed it. It took place in a soulless beige room at the San Francisco County Courthouse, witnessed only by Evelyn Reed and Caleb's equally stoic personal lawyer. There were no flowers, no music, no friends. Mia wore a simple cream-colored dress she'd bought at a second-hand store, feeling like an imposter playing a role she hadn't rehearsed. Caleb wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit that looked more like armor than clothing. He stood beside her, a rigid, unreadable statue, their only physical contact, the brief, cold touch of his hand as he slid a simple, unadorned platinum band onto her finger. The ring felt heavy and foreign on her skin. He recited his vows in the same flat, monotonous tone he used to outline their rules, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over the judge's shoulder. When it was Mia's turn, the traditional words of love and honor felt like lies in her mouth, each syllable a small, sharp betrayal of herself. The judge, a weary-looking man who had clearly seen it all, pronounced them husband and wife with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. There was no celebratory kiss, only an awkward, suffocating silence that was finally broken by Evelyn Reed clearing her throat. "Congratulations," the lawyer said, though the word sounded utterly devoid of its meaning. And just like that, Amelia Peterson, the fiercely independent baker, ceased to exist. In her place was Mrs. Caleb Vance, a title that felt as ill-fitting and foreign as the cold, heavy ring on her finger. Later that afternoon, a sleek black car, so silent it seemed to glide rather than drive, deposited her back at the penthouse. The driver, a man as silent and stoic as his employer, helped her with her single suitcase and a small, insulated tote bag. As she stepped out of the elevator and into the vast, silent expanse of her new reality, a profound sense of dislocation washed over her. This was her home now, a gilded cage she had willingly walked into. She half expected Caleb to be there, to at least acknowledge this new, bizarre chapter of their lives. But the penthouse was empty. The silence was even more profound than before, amplifying the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. On the enormous marble island in the center of the kitchen, a single white envelope rested. Her new name, Amelia Vance, written across it in a sharp, unfamiliar script. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The note inside was not a welcome, not a message of any kind, but a cold, concise itinerary. It detailed his schedule for the next 10 days, a business trip to Tokyo and Seoul. He had already left. Not a word of goodbye, not a single instruction beyond the printed schedule. He had married her and then vanished, leaving her utterly and completely alone in his vast, empty world. She looked around the cavernous space, at the cold marble and the impersonal glass walls that reflected a distorted, lonely version of herself. She had made a deal to save her dream, but in that moment, she feared she had lost herself in the process. From the tote bag at her feet, she carefully lifted a large glass jar. Inside, a pale, bubbly concoction was slowly rising and falling with a life of its own. It was her sourdough starter, the heart of her bakery, a living, breathing culture of wild yeast and bacteria she had nurtured for years. She had named it Bubbles. Carrying it like a precious refugee, she placed the jar squarely in the middle of the cold, sterile kitchen island, a small, defiant act of life in a place that felt like a mausoleum. The silent war had begun. Her first week as Mrs. Caleb Vance was a study in profound and opulent loneliness. She existed as a ghost within the automated luxury of the penthouse. The lights came on as she entered a room and dimmed as she left. The climate control was always a perfect, sterile 72 degrees. A housekeeper, a quiet woman named Maria, who seemed terrified of making eye contact, appeared for a few hours each morning, tidying spaces that were already pristine and preparing meals that Mia rarely had the appetite to eat. Mia spent her days wandering through the East Wing, a series of beautifully appointed but soulless rooms. A bedroom with a bed so large it felt like a raft on a vast, empty sea. A bathroom clad in floor-to-ceiling marble that echoed with every footstep. A sitting room with a state-of-the-art television she never turned on. She tried to establish a routine, to reclaim some small piece of herself. She did yoga on a mat overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, the fog so thick some mornings it felt like she was floating in a cloud. She read novels she checked out from the public library, the act of holding a book with a cracked spine and dog-eared pages feeling like a small rebellion against the sleek, untouchable surfaces of her new environment. And she tended to Bubbles, feeding the sourdough starter its daily meal of flour and water on the gleaming kitchen island, watching with a fierce satisfaction as it thrived, its yeasty aroma a tiny organic pocket of defiance in the otherwise scentless air. She spoke to no one but the doorman and the occasional grocery delivery person, her voice starting to feel rusty from disuse. The silence of the penthouse was a living entity, pressing in on her, magnifying her doubts and fears until they were deafening. "Is this what your life is like all the time?" she asked the empty room one evening, staring at the glittering lights of the city below. "Is this what you paid so much money to protect?" When Caleb finally returned, his arrival was as unceremonious as his departure. He appeared in the kitchen late one night as she was feeding the starter, his presence a sudden jarring disruption to the silent rhythm she had established. He looked tired, his tie loosened and the top button of his shirt undone, but his eyes were as guarded and remote as ever. He didn't acknowledge her presence at first, moving directly to a built-in espresso machine that whirred to life with a hiss. "I trust the accommodations were satisfactory," he said, his back still to her, the words clipped and formal. It felt less like a question about her comfort and more like an inquiry into the performance of his property. "It's very quiet," Mia managed to say, her spoon pausing over the jar of starter. He turned, an espresso cup in his hand, and his eyes finally landed on the jar. A faint line appeared between his brows, the first crack she had seen in his impenetrable facade. "What is that?" he asked, his tone laced with a distinct note of suspicion, as if she had smuggled contraband into his fortress. "It's a sourdough starter," she explained, a small spark of defiance flickering within her. "It needs to be fed every day. It's alive." He stared at the bubbling mixture for a long moment, his expression unreadable but tinged with something that looked like distaste. "Keep it contained," he said finally, before turning and retreating toward his wing of the penthouse, the espresso untouched on the counter. His dismissal was so absolute it was almost comical, yet it stung. He didn't see life. He saw a potential mess, an unapproved variable in his controlled equation. The encounter set the tone for their cohabitation. They were two satellites, orbiting a common center, close enough to feel each other's gravitational pull, but never truly intersecting, their paths rigidly defined by the cold, unbreachable rules he had established from the very beginning. Their first public outing as a married couple was a charity dinner for a local children's hospital, an event teeming with the Bay Area's tech elite and old money families. Mia spent the day in a state of high anxiety, a dress Caleb had arranged to have delivered, a tasteful but unremarkable sheath of dark blue silk, hanging like a costume in her closet. He had left a simple typed note for her. "Be ready at 7. Car will be downstairs." When she emerged from her wing, he was waiting in the grand, sterile living area, looking impossibly handsome in a custom-tailored tuxedo. He looked her over with the critical, impersonal eye of an art appraiser examining a forgery. "That will suffice," he commented, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second too long on the simple silver locket she wore, a worn piece she'd had since childhood. He offered her his arm, and the touch of his sleeve against her hand was like an electric shock, a foreign and unwelcome intimacy. In the car, He briefed her as if she were a new employee heading into a client meeting. "We will be seated with my uncle Marcus Thorne and some members of the board. Smile, be pleasant, and defer to me if asked any direct questions about our relationship. Our official story is that we met through a mutual acquaintance at a gallery opening 6 months ago. It was a whirlwind romance. Keep your answers brief." The condescension in his voice was grating. "I know how to have a conversation, Caleb," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. "I ran a business. I dealt with people every day." He didn't even turn his head. "The people in that room are not your usual clientele, Amelia. They are sharks who smell blood in the water. My blood. Do not give them any." The use of her full name felt like a reprimand, a reminder of her place in this charade. The ballroom was a dazzling, overwhelming assault on the senses, a sea of glittering diamonds, clinking champagne glasses, and the loud, confident hum of wealth and power. Mia felt her carefully constructed composure begin to fray at the edges. Caleb navigated the room with an effortless, icy authority, his hand resting formally on the small of her back. The pressure was a constant, proprietary reminder of her role. He introduced her with the same clipped efficiency. "This is my wife, Amelia." The words sounded foreign and absurd to her own ears. It was during dinner that the first real test came. They were seated at a large circular table dominated by a florid, imposing man with silver hair and shrewd eyes, whom Caleb introduced as his uncle Marcus Thorne. Marcus regarded Mia with an unnerving combination of feigned politeness and overt suspicion. He asked her about her family, her education, her background, his questions like tiny, persistent drills, probing for a weakness. Mia answered with the vague, pleasant deflections Caleb had instructed her on, feeling her smile grow stiff and unnatural. Then, just as the main course was being served, a journalist from a prominent financial publication, a woman with a rapacious smile, leaned across the table. "It's quite the story, Mr. Vance," the journalist said, her voice dripping with insinuation. "You've been San Francisco's most elusive bachelor for a decade. Then, suddenly, a whirlwind romance and a surprise marriage. Everyone is dying to know, how did you two actually meet?" The table fell silent. All eyes turned to them. Mia felt a cold knot of panic tighten in her stomach. She looked at Caleb, expecting him to deliver their pre-rehearsed line with his usual cold precision. But he didn't. He just sat there, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth, his face pale, his eyes wide with a sudden, stark terror she had never seen before. He had completely and utterly frozen. In the echoing silence of the car on the way back to the penthouse, the air was thick with a strange, new tension. Mia sat perfectly still, her hands clenched in the lap of her silk dress, replaying the moment in the ballroom over and over. She had taken a risk, stepping into the spotlight he so clearly abhorred, and she had no idea what the consequences would be. She expected a reprimand, a cold reminder of her place, a lecture on the chain of command in their meticulously constructed farce. But Caleb said nothing. He stared out the window at the blurred city lights, his jaw set so tightly she could see the muscle flexing in his cheek. His silence was somehow more unnerving than any anger he could have expressed. It was a void, and Mia found her thoughts rushing to fill it. Had she helped him, or had she merely exposed his weakness to a room full of sharks, most notably his watchful, predatory uncle? When they arrived, and the elevator doors opened into the vast, silent living area, she finally broke the silence. "Are you all right?" The words felt inadequate, flimsy. He turned to face her, his expression as unreadable as a sheet of steel. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not gratitude, but something more complex, like confusion or even shock. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar, impenetrable mask. "The terms of our agreement did not stipulate that you were to become my spokesman," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. He then turned without another word and walked toward the west wing, his rigid posture a clear dismissal. The invisible wall between them was not only back in place, it felt taller and thicker than ever before, leaving Mia standing alone in the marble entryway, the echo of his footsteps a stark reminder of the chasm that separated their two worlds. Frustrated and emboldened by his retreat, Mia decided that if she was to be a prisoner in this gilded cage, she would at least make her corner of it feel like home. The next morning, she didn't just feed bubbles, she began to bake. She started with a simple focaccia, the process a familiar and comforting balm to her frayed nerves. The rhythmic kneading of the dough, the feel of it coming to life under her hands, the transformative magic of yeast and heat. It was her language, her art. Soon, the sterile ozonic air of the penthouse was pierced by the rich, life-affirming scents of baking bread, rosemary and garlic. The next day she made cinnamon rolls, their sweet, warm aroma a direct affront to the cold, minimalist decor. It was a small, quiet rebellion, a way of asserting her own existence in a space that was designed to erase it. She left a freshly baked roll on a plate on the kitchen island, a silent offering, or perhaps a challenge. Hours later, she noticed the plate was gone, with no comment or acknowledgement. She took it as a victory. The kitchen, once a gleaming, unused showroom, slowly began to bear the marks of life. A fine, almost invisible layer of flour dusted the countertops. A smudge of chocolate appeared on a cabinet handle. The scent of vanilla, cardamom, and toasted sugar began to cling to the air, weaving itself into the very fabric of the penthouse. Caleb's reaction was a study in controlled displeasure. He would enter the kitchen in the morning for his espresso, his movements stiffening, his jaw tightening as he took in the evidence of her domestic insurgency. He never spoke a word about it, but his disapproval was a palpable force in the room, a silent, ongoing battle between his rigid, ordered world and her warm, chaotic one. This silent war of attrition, of yeasty aromas versus sterile air, continued for weeks. Mia began to feel a strange sort of rhythm to their cohabitation, a predictable dance of avoidance. She learned the sound of his footsteps, the quiet hum of the elevator that signaled his departure in the morning and his return. At night, he remained a mystery, a ghost who shared her address, but she was slowly carving out a space for herself within his fortress of solitude. Then, one afternoon, driven by a restless curiosity that had been building for days, she found herself wandering further than usual. She passed the invisible line that demarcated the central living area from his private west wing, her heart thumping with a mixture of fear and defiance. A door at the end of the hall, one she had always assumed led to a storage closet, was slightly ajar. A sliver of soft, warm light spilled out into the otherwise dim hallway, a stark contrast to the harsh LED lighting throughout the rest of the penthouse. It was an invitation she couldn't resist. She pushed the door gently, the hinges moving with a well-oiled silence. The room inside stole her breath. It wasn't a closet or an office. It was a shrine. Every detail was perfectly, heartbreakingly preserved, as if frozen in time. A large mahogany desk stood. Against one wall, a pair of reading glasses resting on an open newspaper dated over a decade ago. Across the room, a woman's cashmere throw was draped over an armchair, a novel lying face down on the cushion, its page marked. The walls were filled not with abstract art, but with photographs of a family, a vibrant, laughing woman with kind eyes, a handsome, smiling man with his arm around her, and a younger, happier version of Caleb, his face open and full of a light she had never seen. It was a room saturated with love, with life, with a past he had hermetically sealed away from his present. It was a tomb, but a beautiful one. She was so engrossed in the ghost story the room was telling that she didn't hear him approach. The first sign she had of his presence was the sudden plunge of the room into shadow. She whirled around to see him standing in the doorway, his body a rigid silhouette against the light of the hall, his face a thunderous mask of cold, white-hot fury. For the first time, the detached billionaire was gone, replaced by something raw and wounded and dangerous. "Get out," he said, his voice unnervingly quiet, each word clipped and sharp like a shard of broken glass. Mia's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't move. All the weeks of being ignored, of being treated like a piece of furniture, coalesced into a single spark of defiance. "Caleb," she started, her voice softer than she intended. He took a step into the room, and the force of his anger was like a physical blow. "I gave you 5 rules, Amelia, 5 simple, clear conditions, the most important of which was to respect my privacy. You have been in this house for over a month. Was that one rule so difficult for you to comprehend?" The use of her full name again, this time wielded like a weapon. "The door was open," she countered, her voice trembling slightly but holding firm. "I didn't break in." His laugh was a harsh, bitter sound that held no humor. "You see an open door and you simply walk through it. You take what you want. That is what this is all about, isn't it? The money, the house. This was just another door you felt entitled to open." The accusation was so unfair, so cruel, that it extinguished her fear and ignited her own anger. "This isn't a room, Caleb," she retorted, her voice rising to match his intensity. "It's a mausoleum. You're not living in this house, you're haunting it. You've sealed away everything that ever mattered to you, and you're punishing the entire world for it, starting with yourself." The words hung in the air between them, shocking them both into silence. She had crossed a line, a deeply personal and unforgivable one. The fury in his eyes was swiftly encased in ice, his expression becoming terrifyingly blank. "Your observations are not part of our arrangement," he said, his voice flat and dead. "You will leave this wing now, and you will not return. If you violate my privacy again, our contract will be terminated. Consider this your only warning." He stepped aside, his gesture an order. Defeated, Mia walked past him, the warmth of the memorial room replaced by the chilling cold of his renewed, reinforced hatred. The truce, cold as it was shattered. The weeks that followed were marked by an oppressive, glacial silence. They were no longer just avoiding each other. A palpable animosity now radiated from the West Wing. The penthouse felt smaller, the air thicker, the loneliness more acute. Their next public obligation, the annual Silicon Valley Innovators Gala, loomed like a sentence. It was the premier event of the season, a night where billions of dollars in net worth would be crammed into one ostentatious ballroom. The stakes were higher, the scrutiny more intense. This time, there was no pre-event briefing. He simply left a box on the console table by the elevator containing a breathtaking gown of emerald green velvet and a note that said, 8 p.m. sharp. The performance that night was their most convincing yet, born of the desperate need to maintain a flawless facade. In front of the cameras and the prying eyes of the tech world, they were a portrait of sophisticated elegance. Caleb's hand never left her back, a gesture that felt both possessive and, strangely, supportive. At one point, as they navigated a crowded path, a clumsy waiter stumbled, sending a tray of champagne flutes crashing to the floor. Mia lost her footing on the slick marble, and in a flash, Caleb's arm was around her waist, pulling her securely against him. The moment lasted only a second, but it was long enough for Mia to feel the solid warmth of his body, the surprising strength in his grip. Her breath caught in her throat. He looked down at her, his grey eyes for the first time, seeming to actually see her, and the world narrowed to the few inches between their faces. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. She shook her head, unable to speak. The spell was broken by a flurry of apologies from the waiter, but the phantom sensation of his arm around her, of that fleeting, unguarded concern, lingered for the rest of the evening. a confusing and deeply unsettling warmth in the pit of her stomach. That night, sleep was an impossibility. The brief, accidental intimacy at the gala had unsettled something deep within her. It was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of a different man than the one who had looked at her with such cold fury in the memorial room. Restless, she found herself pacing the silent penthouse, the glittering cityscape outside a blur of indifferent lights. An invisible string seemed to pull her toward the West Wing, toward his study. She knew it was a terrible idea, a blatant violation of his final warning, but the need to understand him, to reconcile the cold tyrant with the man who had caught her so gently, was an overwhelming compulsion. The door to his office was closed, but unlocked. She slipped inside, her heart pounding. The room was the nerve center of his empire, dominated by a massive desk and an array of sleek monitors, all dark for the night. But on the corner of the desk, illuminated by the soft moonlight filtering through the window, sat an object that was completely out of place. It was a worn, dark leather journal, its cover softened with age, held shut by a simple elastic strap. It looked ancient, personal, an analog artifact in a digital world. It was the kind of object that held secrets. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. She knew she shouldn't. It was the ultimate trespass. But the memory of his fleeting concern, of the profound sadness in the memorial room, pushed her forward. She slipped the elastic band off and opened it to a random page. The handwriting was sharp, slanted, the ink a faded black. It was a journal. His journal, and as she read the first entry, the world fell away. October 12th. It has been 10 years since the sound of the rain on the roof, the glare of the headlights, the smell of burnt rubber. They say time heals all wounds, but they lie. Time is a poison. It doesn't heal. It calcifies. It turns grief into a stone you carry in your gut, a permanent, indigestible weight. I am still on that road. I will always be on that road. Night after night, Mia returned to the study, her secret visits becoming a dangerous, obsessive ritual. The journal became her catechism, a sacred text that slowly unraveled the enigma of Caleb Vance. With every page, she turned. The cold, arrogant billionaire dissolved, replaced by a young man trapped in a prison of guilt and self-loathing. She read about his crippling loneliness, his conviction that he was unworthy of connection, his belief that his coldness was a necessary shield to protect others from the curse he believed he carried. The entries were a raw, unfiltered chronicle of a man punishing himself for a crime for which he had never been tried. He wrote about the vintage Aston Martin, the car from the accident, which he kept hidden in a private garage, like a reliquary of his own damnation. He described the suffocating pressure of upholding his father's legacy, a legacy he felt he had desecrated with his recklessness. Mia's anger toward him slowly dissolved, replaced by a deep, aching compassion that terrified her. She was falling for the ghost in the pages of a book, a man he kept hidden from the entire world, and most of all, from himself. One night, she found the entry she had been subconsciously searching for, the one that detailed the accident itself. It was written with a horrifying, clinical detachment that was more heartbreaking than any emotional outburst. He described the slick roads, the argument with his father about his future, the moment he took his eyes off the road. He wrote about waking up in the hospital, the searing pain in his leg, a footnote to the unbearable agony of learning he was the sole survivor. As Mia finished reading the last gut-wrenching sentence, her eyes drifted to the date scrawled at the top of the page. A glacial cold, far colder than any San Francisco fog, seeped into her bones, chilling her to her very soul. The anniversary of the worst day of his life, the day his world had ended, the day his parents had died, was tomorrow. The morning of the anniversary dawned gray and oppressive. The sky a bruised, featureless expanse that perfectly mirrored the atmosphere inside the penthouse. A heavy, somber silence had fallen, thicker and more suffocating than ever before. Caleb had been a phantom since sunrise, a fleeting shadow she had glimpsed moving towards the gym in the pre-dawn hours, his movements unnaturally stiff and controlled. Mia's heart ached with the weight of the knowledge she carried. While the world saw this as just another Tuesday, she knew that for the man in the West Wing, it was a day of reckoning, a forced march through the most traumatic landscape of his memory. The rules of their contract, the walls he had built, seemed not only cruel in the face of his suffering, but utterly irrelevant. She couldn't speak to him, couldn't offer a word of comfort without revealing her transgression. Yet to do nothing felt like a profound act of cruelty. Her hands, needing a task to quiet the frantic energy in her soul, found their way to the familiar comfort of flour and sugar. She scanned the pages of his journal in her mind, searching for an answer, and found one in a brief, poignant entry from years ago where he had described the simple apple coffee cake his mother used to bake on rainy Sunday mornings, the scent of cinnamon and baked apples, the only thing that could chase away the gloom. It was a monumental risk, an intimate gesture that crossed every single one of his carefully drawn lines, but it was an act of compassion, and she decided that was a law higher than any contract. With painstaking care, she replicated the recipe, her movements a prayer in the silent kitchen. She placed the finished cake, warm and fragrant, on the marble island, a silent, edible message that simply said, "I know this day is hard. You are not entirely alone." She then retreated to her wing, her heart pounding, leaving the offering in the silence for him to discover. From the omniscient quiet of his sterile world, Caleb emerged from his office hours later, his mind a maelstrom of repressed memory and enforced control. The anniversary was a physical illness, a fever of grief that he endured each year, through a ritual of absolute isolation and punishing self-reflection. His plan was the same as always: drive to his secluded cabin in Big Sur, a Spartan refuge of wood and glass perched on the edge of a cliff, and let the ghosts have their way with him for 24 hours. As he walked through the central living area, a scent stopped him dead in his tracks. Cinnamon, baked apples. It was a scent so deeply embedded in the lost country of his childhood that for a dizzying, heart-stopping moment, he thought he had lost his mind. His eyes fell upon the coffee cake resting on the island, a warm, golden circle of impossible memory. He approached it as one would a wild, unpredictable animal. It couldn't be, and yet it was. He knew with a certainty that defied all logic that this was his mother's recipe. The way the cinnamon was swirled, the specific crumble of the streusel topping, it was a perfect, tangible echo of a life he had locked away. He stood staring at it for a full minute, the carefully constructed walls of his composure beginning to fracture. A tsunami of memory, his mother humming in the kitchen, the flour on her cheek, the warmth of her hand, crashed against the dam of his grief. He didn't touch the cake. He couldn't. To do so would be to surrender completely. With a surge of renewed panic, he turned and fled the penthouse, grabbing his keys and escaping to the one place he could be sure the past, in all its fragrant, complicated warmth, could not follow. Mia watched from her window as Caleb's car, a sleek silver arrow, disappeared into the downtown traffic. The untouched cake on the island felt like a failure, a foolish, sentimental gesture that had likely only angered him further. The crushing weight of her miscalculation settled over her as she resigned herself to a day of solitude. It was late afternoon when her phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. A mutual acquaintance suggested we talk. "I have some information I think you'll find valuable. Meet me at the Blue Bottle in an hour. Marcus Thorne." A chill of apprehension snaked down her spine. The meeting was a trap. She knew it instinctively, but the vague threat was one she couldn't ignore. She found him at a corner table, exuding an air of slick, predatory charm. He rose as she approached, his smile all teeth. "Amelia, so glad you could make it." he said, his tone oozing a false familiarity that made her skin crawl. He wasted no time. He slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were photographs. Her in the East Wing, Caleb in the West, her coming home alone with groceries, Caleb leaving for Big Sur that morning, alone. They were grainy, long-lens shots, but the story they told was clear. Their marriage was a sham. "Caleb is unwell," Marcus began, his voice dropping into a tone of mock concern. "He's been unstable for years, trapped by the past. This elaborate charade proves it. The board is concerned. I am concerned." He leaned in, his eyes gleaming with ambition. "I'm prepared to offer you $500,000, double what he's paying you, in exchange for a simple affidavit. A statement that he coerced you into this arrangement due to his mental instability. You walk away a wealthy woman, free of this mess, and I can finally get my nephew the help he so desperately needs by taking control of the company." The audacity, the sheer naked greed of it, was breathtaking. Mia looked at the photos, then at the man before her, and all her fear was replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Absolutely not." Marcus's smile faltered. "Don't be a fool. Loyalty to a contract is one thing, but he's a sinking ship. I'm offering you a lifeboat." Mia stood up, her gaze unwavering. "You're not offering me a lifeboat, Mr. Thorne. You're asking me to help you drown your own nephew, and my answer is no." The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Having failed to buy her cooperation, Marcus unleashed his nuclear option. By the next morning, the internet was on fire. The story, broken by the journalist from the dinner party, was the lead item on every major financial news site, a salacious cocktail of high finance and personal scandal. Billionaire bride buy, Vance, CEO's marriage, $1 million sham. Inside Caleb Vance's phony union, sources claim tech titan unstable. The articles were brutal, filled with the damning photos Marcus had shown her. Anonymous quotes from concerned board members, and a thinly veiled narrative painting Caleb as a manipulative, unstable recluse, and Mia as a calculating gold digger. The digital firestorm quickly leaped into the real world. As Mia numbly scrolled through the headlines, a friend from her old neighborhood sent her a photo. It was of the front of the Daily Rise. Scrawled across the cheerful blue door in angry red spray paint was a single word: gold digger. The sight of it, the violation of her sanctuary, was a physical blow. She felt the air leave her lungs. Later that day, Evelyn Reed arrived, her usual immaculate composure showing visible cracks. "The board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning," the lawyer said, her voice strained. "Marcus is invoking the morality clause in the corporate bylaws. They're going to vote to have him removed as CEO. The stock has already dropped 12%. Just then, Caleb returned. He walked into the penthouse looking like a man who had been through a war, his face pale and drawn, his eyes hollowed out. He saw Evelyn, saw the frantic news playing on the television, saw the look of despair on Mia's face, and his shattered expression hardened into one of bleak, weary resignation. "Heard you had a meeting with my uncle," he said, his voice raspy with defeat. "He must have made you a better offer. You should have taken it." The accusation, the assumption of her betrayal after everything she had learned, was the cruelest cut of all, a final, devastating blow that left them standing on opposite sides of a smoking crater of scandal and mistrust. In the aftermath of his words, as he retreated into the silence of his wing, something inside Mia broke. But it wasn't her spirit. It was the last, brittle remnant of the scared, helpless girl who had learned to run from conflict. His assumption of her betrayal, so deeply rooted in his own self-loathing, didn't infuriate her. It clarified everything. He wasn't pushing her away, his pain was. He had spent a decade, building walls to protect himself, and now, at the moment of his greatest crisis, he was defaulting to his programming. Trust no one. To run now to try and save herself would be to prove him right. It would be to confirm his deepest, darkest fear, that he was unworthy of loyalty, that everyone eventually leaves, and she would not do that to him. A fierce, protective resolve she didn't know she possessed surged through her. She would not run, she would fight, but not in his world, not with lawyers and accusations. She would fight in hers. She spent the entire night not packing a bag, but hunched over her laptop, surrounded by her old baking notebooks, business plans, and supplier invoices. She dove into Vance Enterprises' public financial reports, their corporate mission statements, their employee satisfaction surveys. A plan began to form, a wild, audacious idea that stitched together the two disparate parts of her life: the warm, community-focused ethos of the Daily Rise, and the cold corporate machinery of his billion-dollar tech empire. It was a plan to prove she was more than a contractual wife, more than a gold digger. It was a plan to prove she was a partner and that her vision had value. It was a plan to save him by showing him and the entire world not what she wanted to take, but what she was capable of building. The Vance Enterprises boardroom was a theater of corporate execution. It was a cold, intimidating space on the top floor with a monolithic granite table and a panoramic view of the bay that seemed to mock the drama unfolding within. Caleb sat at the head of the table, not in defiance, but in surrender. He looked exhausted, a king awaiting his deposition. Marcus Thorne was pacing, his voice resonating with faux gravity as he delivered the killing blow, outlining Caleb's erratic behavior and the catastrophic reputational damage to the company. The man who leads this company must be a symbol of stability, of unimpeachable character, Marcus declared, his eyes sweeping across the grim-faced board members. My nephew, as much as it pains me to say it, is no longer that man. He was calling for the vote, the final nail in the coffin, when the heavy boardroom doors swung open. Mia stood there, not looking like a victim or a scorned wife, but like a woman on a mission. She wore a simple professional dress. Her hair was pulled back, and in her hands she held a tablet. A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. I apologize for the interruption, she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the terror she felt. My name is Amelia Peterson, and while my private life has unfortunately become a topic of public speculation, I am here today to talk about business. Before anyone could object, she walked to the head of the table, not next to Caleb, but to the presentation screen. With a click, she brought up a detailed professional presentation. Vance Enterprises prides itself on innovation, she began, her voice gaining strength. But innovation is driven by people, and your current corporate wellness program is underperforming, leading to a 15% employee turnover in your R&D department, costing you millions in recruitment and lost productivity. She laid out a fully costed proposal for a new, holistic employee wellness initiative centered around locally sourced, high-quality food to foster community and creativity. The centerpiece, a flagship Daily Rise at Vance Cafe on their main campus, subsidized by the company, which would also fund a community program for aspiring local food entrepreneurs. She presented data, projected ROI, and a clear, passionate vision. She wasn't pleading for her husband, she was fighting for the soul of his company. Caleb watched her, utterly mesmerized. He had expected tears, accusations, a messy personal plea. He had never, in his wildest imagination, expected this. He watched as she transformed the narrative from a sordid scandal about a gold digger into a brilliant business proposition from a savvy entrepreneur. She wasn't just defending him, she was elevating him, showing the board and himself a future for his company that was brighter, warmer, and more human. She showed them that she saw his company not as a bank vault, but as a community. Her belief in him, expressed not through words of affection, but through this powerful, intelligent, and deeply practical act of partnership, was like a lightning bolt to his soul. It was the first ray of light to pierce the decade-long fog of his grief. When she finished, a stunned silence filled the room. The board members looked from her presentation to Caleb. Their expressions shifted from judgment to intrigue. The narrative had been flipped. Mia had not proven her love. She had proven her worth. Empowered by her incredible gesture, Caleb stood up, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt the ground solid beneath his feet. He looked directly at his uncle, and then at the board. "My uncle is correct about one thing," he began, his voice quiet, but resonating with a new, authentic authority. "I have been living under the shadow of a personal tragedy for many years. I allowed my grief to isolate me, and for that I apologize. I believed that strength meant solitude, but I was wrong." He looked at Mia, a universe of emotion passing between them in a single glance. True strength lies in partnership, in building something better together. Ms. Peterson's proposal is not just a good idea. It is the future of this company's culture, a culture I am, for the first time in a long time, excited to lead. He held the board's gaze, no longer a wounded recluse, but a confident, vulnerable, and compelling leader. The vote, when it was called, was not even close. Marcus Thorne's motion was defeated, his attempted coup crumbling into a humiliating failure. That night, the penthouse was no longer silent. The oppressive quiet had been replaced by the soft, hesitant murmur of conversation, a sound more intimate and profound than any shout or proclamation. They sat, not in their separate wings, but together on a sofa in the central living area. The glittering city lights outside a silent witness to the demolition of the final wall between them. The rules were gone, the contract a meaningless relic of a life that no longer existed. It was Caleb who spoke first, his voice raw with an emotion she had only ever read in the pages of his journal. He told her everything. He spoke of the rain-slicked road, the weight of his father's expectations, the argument, the blinding headlights. He spoke of the guilt that had been his constant companion, a parasite that had fed on his happiness for a decade. He spoke not to a contractual partner, but to the woman who had walked into the heart of his fortress and shown him not pity, but strength. Mia listened, her heart aching with a compassion that was now intertwined with a deep and abiding love. She didn't offer empty platitudes or easy forgiveness. She simply listened, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of his confession. When he was finished, a profound peace settled between them. He reached across the space that separated them and took her hand. His touch was no longer the cold, formal gesture of their public performances, but a warm, grounding connection. It was a beginning, forged in the crucible of a public scandal, a business proposal, and the quiet courage of a baker who refused to believe that some hearts were beyond healing. Their one-year contract was over, but their story, the real one, had just begun. A year later, they stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the early morning sun casting a golden glow over the city. The space behind them was unrecognizable. The stark white walls were now a warm cream, shelves overflowed with books, and lush green plants cascaded from hanging pots. The air smelled not of sterile ozone, but faintly of lemon verbena and fresh coffee. They held hands, the simple, unadorned platinum bands they had exchanged at the courthouse replaced by new rings, intricately designed and worn with the easy comfort of genuine affection. They were not renewing vows. They were making them for the first time, the quiet words of love and commitment, whispered only to each other, carried away on the gentle bay breeze. It was a promise not of performance, but of presence. Below them, on the sprawling, manicured campus of Vance Enterprises, a crowd was gathering. A large, cheerful banner fluttered in the wind, bearing a familiar, heartwarming logo, The Daily Rise at Vance, grand opening. It was more beautiful than Mia had ever dreamed. A stunning space of reclaimed wood, warm lighting and gleaming copper, the air already thick with the scent of fresh bread and brewing coffee. It was not just a bakery, it was a testament, a thriving symbol of their merged worlds, a place where innovation and nourishment went hand in hand. The first recipient of their new community entrepreneurship program, a young woman with a passion for artisan cheese, was cutting a ceremonial ribbon alongside the mayor. It was a day of celebration, a culmination of a journey that had begun with a bright red eviction notice and a desperate, impossible choice. The following week, Caleb led Mia down to a part of his world she had never seen, a private, climate-controlled garage deep beneath a downtown high-rise. Under a grey silk cover sat the unmistakable, elegant curves of a vintage Aston Martin, its silver paint gleaming even in the dim light. It was a ghost, a magnificent, beautiful machine that had been the instrument of his life's greatest tragedy. He pulled the cover back slowly, the silence of the garage heavy with unspoken history. For a long moment, they just stood there, looking at the car that had been both a prison and a shrine for over a decade. He still held the keys, a tangible link to his guilt. Mia gently placed her hand over his. "It's a beautiful car," she said softly. "It's a part of your story, but it doesn't have to be the whole story." He looked from the car to her, his eyes clear and steady. The next day, arrangements were made. The Aston Martin was donated to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, part of an exhibit on industrial design, its plaque detailing its history and its new role as a gift to the city in memory of Thomas and Eleanor Vance. It was an act of release, of transforming a symbol, of private pain into a piece of public art, honoring the past without being eternally chained to it. The penthouse kitchen, once a sterile, untouched showroom, was now the chaotic, flour-dusted heart of their home. One Saturday afternoon, Caleb, in a rare moment of whimsy, had insisted on learning how to shape a baguette. The result was a hilarious disaster. Flour was everywhere, on his nose, in his hair, and in a fine white powder across the once pristine marble floor. Mia laughed, a full, joyous sound that echoed through the vast space as he held up a lopsided, twisted length of dough with a look of mock seriousness. "I believe my talents lie in appreciation, not creation," he declared, pulling her into his arms, his hands leaving white prints on the back of her shirt. She reached up and wiped a smudge of flour from his cheek, her touch lingering. In that simple domestic moment, covered in the mess of their shared life, they were no longer a billionaire and a baker bound by a contract. They were simply Caleb and Mia, a man and a woman who had found in each other's broken pieces the blueprint for a love that was stronger and more resilient than anything they could have ever built alone. Their journey hadn't been a fairy tale. It had been a difficult, painful negotiation between two wounded souls who had learned that true independence isn't about standing alone, but about having the strength to finally let someone in. It was a love story written not in the ink of a contract, but in the enduring, life-affirming language of flour, forgiveness, and the quiet, defiant rise of a brand new day.